Good morning. So, with the whole tariff situation that is kind of dominating the news now, or has been anyway, you can start to see the fog is starting to dissipate a little bit, right? And if you're looking and watching, you can kind of see what the main aim of uh, America is at the moment. And I think it's China, right? So, Trump has been speaking about China since his first run, right? His first presidency. And China, for at least the last 25 years, right, it has been growing as an economy and as a power, right? But it doesn't seem to, it's communist in nature, right? But it had to, not that it had to, right? But it chose to adopt certain capitalist policies and tendencies, right? To balloon up and to boost up the productivity of the country and also the overall power of the country, right? So if you have hundreds of millions of people who are in poverty and struggling day to day, right? There's no, their motivation is survival and subsistence, right? But if you can bring those people up to a level where they're not worried about eating or anything like that anymore, they're just worried about making money and working, they're far more productive, right? In terms of getting a whole nation working. So China began doing that. And it began to produce loads of things, right? And you can take, like, the Made in China logo is, you're nearly expecting to see it underneath everything, right? Because what they do is they produce loads of things, trinkets and nonsense and just silly things, right? That no one really needs. But when you produce billions and billions and billions of these things and sell these into a market, right? The WTO, right, the thing that Trump is after kind of stepping away from, the World Trade Organization, right? China was allowed into that in 2001, which opened up Western markets and most markets for China. So they could use their people to produce all of these things because they have people in abundance, right? So they will overproduce people. They'll overproduce other nations, nearly based solely on the people power that they have. So they can produce and produce and produce and produce and produce. And because it's a totalitarian regime, right, where life, it doesn't seem to mean much, right? The overall aim of China is pride in yourself, in your race, in your party, in your nation, right? But it's a total, you're controlled, right? You're controlled. All policies, all decisions, what media you can take in, no different in Ireland at the moment, right, to a degree. But what media you can take in, what choices you can have, what religious affiliations you can have, what philosophical positions you can hold, and what political positions you can hold. They're all totally controlled, right? As far as I understand it, I've never been to China, right? But as far as I understand it. But they put their people to work. And then they started selling all of these things into European markets, into American markets, into worldwide markets. And people started buying it, right? So China's money, the power they had, their economy started growing. So they started paying their people. And what they also started doing is using that money that comes from, in our case, Ireland. Ireland buys loads of things from China. China then uses that money and will loan it back to other countries. Take Venezuela or something like that, for example, right? China will loan this money back to these nations and for future investment, right? So building dams, draining marsh, draining swamp, all that sort of thing. Establishing ports that are productive. And China will be a partner with that, right? So they've been in. It's no different than what America and the IMF and that were doing to control different nations. It's just a different spin on it, right? So they would loan this money to these nations and they would become like business partners, right? With loads of different nations across the world. And China Their economy continues to get strong because they're plugged into the natural resources now of different countries. They're now able to use their ports so they can open up trade more efficiently, and all of these things that they're producing based on the people power they have in the country, they can start exporting them at a higher and greater frequency, right? More ships, arriving better, more ports, more access points, more entry points, more profitability. They continue to take in money, right? But they're not buying back. This is the issue. So China, Trump is saying that China has a $1 trillion trade deficit with America, which means Americans buy from China. China takes that money, invests it into their military, and invests it into the expansion of their influence around the world. But they don't buy back from America. So over time, what you see, and other nations as well, is China just essentially stripping the wealth from these nations and reinvesting it into themselves. Is that smart for China? Of course it is. Of course it is, right? But is that good for other nations, given the nature of the Chinese Communist Party, right? That form of government. It's not. You can't continuously use your own nation's wealth to buy from China to empower it financially, so it will continue to grow its economy, continue to grow its geopolitical influence and its trade influence and its military and its technology, right? Because the one thing, or the few things that China does buy from other nations, they're all a few like luxury items and that, right, keep the people happy. But predominantly it is mineral wealth, semiconductors, technologies that will empower Chinese military technology and capabilities, right? So Trump looks like he was obviously on the ball with this stuff more than any of us could be, right? Because he's going to be aware of the inside outs of it. And we're just stuck on the surface level to a degree, right? But he seemed to have had his eye on that. Now, could he go directly at China? He could have. But China's influence, remember in Ireland there was a Chinese police station only closed there shortly after it was discovered, right? Probably moved somewhere else or just went into shadow. But China were comfortable enough and confident enough in their position in Ireland to open up a police station. And they say it's to encourage like Chinese nationals to come home or to whatever, right? They're obviously, you can't have that. It's illegal. You can't have your own police station where you're attempting to implement your law in a different nation. You can't have that. But this is the attitude, right? This is the attitude that the Chinese Communist Party has, right? The world is not enough, right? And that's probably their aim. And they believe that they're the God-given right nearly to have it, right? Or a prideful right based on the excellence of their own people, right? To have that or to take that. And they've been doing a good job of it, right? So China is Europe's second highest trade partner, right? And the numbers are around, I think it was 2023 numbers I was looking at. Europe pumps about 730 billion euros or dollars, whatever you want to call it, into the Chinese economy. They buy nearly 3/4 of a trillion worth of goods from China. But China only pumps back in about a third of that money into Europe. So they have probably a 500 billion surplus trade with Europe. So essentially, Europe gives 750 billion of its money to China. They get the goods and whatever. They only get back about a third of that. So Europe is out of pocket with China. And what do Europe buy from China? Electric vehicles. Now Wi-Fi what are they called? Modems. That sort of thing. Huawei phones. Solar panels and the windmills, right? The wind turbines for the green energy. China produces that stuff and sells it to the EU, right? And in COVID as well, where do you think all your masks and all that stuff came from? They're all made in China, most of them anyway, right? So made in China, made in China. So billions and billions and billions, a massive transfer of wealth has been ongoing between Europe and China for decades now. For decades. And their policies are nearly the same, right? Because they both rule in a similar fashion, right? China seems to be, looks on the surface at least, to be a little bit more extreme. I would say that it's probably not, but the EU is more savvy at what it's doing, right? It probably doesn't have to plunge to lower approaches of, I suppose you can't even say this anymore, of arresting people for being political opponents, because that is what's happening in across Europe and specifically England at this stage, right? But so is Trump could Trump have taken on China directly? He could have, right? But did he? No, he didn't. What he chose to do was alienate it from a trade partner, which was Europe. So he placed the tariffs on Europe. Europe buckled and went, hang on a second now, that's not good for us. Let's sit down and make a deal. Grand. We'll negotiate. And Trump then kicked the tariffs down the road for 90 days. So that threat is hanging over Europe. So Europe are on their best behaviour for the next 90 days. Otherwise, they'll be crippled financially. And what happens with that? People get unsatisfied with things. Jobs are lost. People are worried and concerned. Who do they turn to? They turn to blame the government. And if each independent nation state in Europe are feeling the same pinch and burn, they're going to be looking to get rid of their government, number one, or number two, get out of the EU. Because remember, Trump is tariffing the EU as a bloc. The same way the EU doesn't allow independent nation states to make independent trade deals. They make trade deals as a bloc. So Trump is treating them accordingly. Their great strength, he's using it as the weakness for them. And what this is doing is pissing nation states off and people from independent nation states. And it will only get worse provided that these tariffs increase or persist. And Europe, if they were to come out fighting and enter into, you put on a 50% tariff, we'll do the same. Remember, Canada was doing that. Europe is not the economy America is. So it will lose that. And it will lose that. And in the process of losing that trade war, it will destroy a lot of people's lives in Europe. Which means that people will just demand that either these politicians leave their nation states and the EU, or they'll just overthrow them, right? And those that are in power in the EU, of course, they recognise this. So Canada started throwing its weight around as well, saying that they would match the American tariffs, right? They won't back down, and they're not in a position to win that. So why would you put your people through that, right? But who was Canada controlled by? Largely China, right? And you remember as well, when Trump put the tariffs on Europe, he said a few things. He said, be brave, don't buckle, and don't retaliate. And you'll be good. You'll be rewarded for not retaliating, right? Because what did he want to do? I think he wanted to see who is willing to go down with the ship, or who is willing to stand across the line from America with China. And who retaliated? China did. Canada did. EU said, look, we'll negotiate and we'll wait the 90 days. So the EU now are not going to be a factor. It's not, the EU aren't going to cozy up and side with China now at this stage, because they're too worried about their 90 days falling apart and tariffs being reapplied to them and their economies being destroyed and their people getting upset and the people demanding change and the people overthrowing the government. That's what they're worried about now, is maintaining their throne. So they're probably not too worried about what America does to China at the moment, right? But China are. Because China's economy is built on, by most degrees, pure corruption. Right, they're stealing intellectual property. If you go into business in China, you need to be buddied up with a Chinese company that is in the same kind of area, right? And then what tends to happen is the Chinese company that's involved in, let's just say, some mobile phone company who went over there, that company just goes away, and it's not there anymore. And because Western phone company number one no longer has that business partner in China, they can't do business there anymore. so they have to leave, right? So what does China have? It still has the intellectual property that is after stealing from this or by this Chinese business partner company from the Western company. But now the Western company is not able to do business in China. So China doesn't have the competition there, but it has the intellectual property, right? So it'll just steal ideas from the West and then just sell them to their people. So there's no massive benefit from dealing with China, large scale or long term, other than Ireland benefits from this with things like Shein, right? This company that makes clothes, sells clothes at cheap enough prices, and people love it, right? Women love it. So there's big business, but that could be gone, right? Which will free up, or even, it will force Irish people to spend money in other areas that are not online or that are online but are Western companies as well, right? So having China pump all of their cheap stuff into Western markets, it dilutes the market. It puts people out of business, right? Because there's just loads and loads and loads of stuff at really, really cheap prices, and people go, yay, that's great. And it is great if you're just thinking about yourself and thinking about the euro value you have for what you're buying. But other companies can't compete with that, right? Because they don't have the people power to mass produce these things that China does. And China doesn't have to pay people at the same rates that it pays, or that Western nations and companies would have to pay their people. So they just break the laws and break the rules. They don't abide by Western laws, right? They don't abide by them, but we do. So they automatically have an advantage in terms of them selling into the European market or the American market, right? And it's not good for Irish people, it's not good for Western nations, and it's not good for America. It's not good for Western civilization, right? So China's economy could tank, because if they don't have the ability to continuously export and sell at the rate they've been doing, they're not taking in that much money. So their economy will fold, right? Or it'll be massively hit. And their people will get annoyed because they've been elevated to a certain standard of living that they weren't up to, right? So they went from like slave-driven communism under Mao, right? He might have bumped up a few people or massive amounts of people, but it was nowhere near Western standards, right? But China are kind of there or thereabouts now, and their people are after getting accustomed to living that way. So if that falls, Chinese people will not be happy with that. Will they be allowed to vote out Xi? No, right? But in order to save a bit of face, the Communist Party might have to get rid of him and put in someone else, right? So whatever way that looks like, that's China's problem, and may they see a better day at the end of it, right? But in terms of how that stands with Europe, it's a fascinating thing, because Europe have been sidelined as a potential partner for China in America going head to head with it in terms of tariffs. Because Trump would be in a very different situation if he had to worry about Europe and China coming together and retaliating together. He sidestepped that. He has Europe cooling off in the corner now for 90 days, right? And he can try and, I suppose, make China fold in those 90 days. And if China do fold, and if their economy suffers, they won't be able to back Russia, right? They won't be able to continue backing Russia financially. So Russia will have to cease that war in Ukraine, because they won't be able to continue it, right? So these are fascinating things. And to ourselves in our day-to-day living, we will see the inconvenience of it when so many of these goods that we're surrounded by that come from China are just not there anymore, right? But there's a benefit to be taken out of that. Native industry will grow again, because it won't be priced out of the market, so to speak, right? So that's always a positive. But it looks like that's the route that Trump has taken, and that's what he's been after, and that's what he's going for. And there's benefits across the board, right? Long term especially. Short term stings and inconvenience, probably, most likely, nearly guaranteed. But long term benefits, absolutely. Absolutely.